Yo, so guys, welcome back to another video, and this is another random reaction for the second channel, and the video is every country England has invaded visualized. I'm struggling to talk today, I don't know why. I'm just struggling, I'm struggling to string sentences together. What is going on? But yeah, this is just, I don't think this was even suggested, I just saw this pop up and I just thought, this could be a good video for the memes, because I know these comment sections are going to be full of how, what is it, we blew like a 20 colony lead or whatever it was, like whatever the meme is. And it is funny because I know like there was a point where England or Britain, however you want to put it, had, was it like 1/3 of the country, maybe 1/3 of the country, 1/3 of the countries in the world, maybe, I don't, maybe 1/4, I'm not too sure the exact specifics. But now you look at us, nothing's there, and I think that's for the good. I mean, obviously I don't really actually care for this sort of stuff in terms of like being in control of other countries. It just isn't something that I really am bothered in terms of just like being a superpower. I just feel like countries should leave themselves to themselves in terms of just like letting them do what they do, unless it's like dictatorships, like things like that. Like there's obviously circumstances where that should happen, but I think I'm just rambling at this point. I'm interested in this. I know we like we were in control. I don't know what the right term would be either. In control, I guess maybe that's the right term. What is the actual term it is? It's like colonization, of course, but I don't know what the exact term is. But countries like India, Australia, the US. Yeah, the US, because obviously the video that I did in the past. A lot of countries like from Africa, a lot of Asian countries. I don't know if there's any European countries. Maybe there was like one or two. I'm not too sure about that. And yeah, I mean, and maybe Canada as well. Again, I'm not 100% sure of all the countries, but I'm interested in seeing other ones that I wouldn't have known of. And I assume it's going to go in order from like the first to the last, and then I don't know if we'll touch upon how the countries then left. We'll see if that happens or not. But let's just get into this and see this video. Hopefully, guys going to enjoy. And yeah.
This video is made possible by CuriosityStream. Watch all
Get
of
your
my
money,
videos
bro.
CuriosityStream.com. British
that
have been
money.
responsible by Floor. For a good chunk of the past few centuries, this music was the final boss music played for people across the entire world.
Really?
The English and later the British have been responsible for invading and conquering more countries and people than any other nation in human history. And honestly, it's startling just how many places they've been to. In this video, I'm going to do my best at attempting to visualize all of Britain's invasions and conquests for you, continent by continent, in as brief a time as possible. So let's begin with the closest continent to Britain, Europe. Ireland was the first target of British conquest and was invaded as early as 1169. Within 400 years of gradual conquests, the entire island was ruled by the British and remained that way until most of it was granted independence in 19...
Okay, I like this, and it's gonna show like when they left and like sort of what caused these kind of stuff. I like this. This is gonna be a very, very interesting video.
1921. Historically, France has probably been invaded by the English more times than any other country in the world.
Wait,
Just
really?
take a look at this huge list of invasions. There's not even enough time to talk about a third of these, and for a time, all of this territory inside of modern France was directly controlled by the English, with Calais being the final piece that fell in 1557. Well, except for that time when the British took over Corsica for a couple years. The British continue to invade Spain by the millions every winter, but in the past, they've come with a lot less friendly intentions. English and later British soldiers invaded under the Black Prince in 1367 and continued on through the first, second, third, and fourth raids on Cadiz, and that time when the British took over Gibraltar.
Yeah, Gibraltar is still a British colony, I think. I don't actually know.
And Minorca. They gave Minorca back, but decided on keeping Gibraltar forever. In recent history, the British have invaded Belgium in order to support the Belgians, but that wasn't always the case.
So
they conducted two pretty large-scale invasions of modern-day Belgium in 1654 and again in 1701, and Flanders itself was ruled by the English for a few years in the 14th century. The Netherlands was one of England's historical arch-rivals, and so there's been plenty of invasions going in this direction across the 17th and 18th centuries. In 1940, the British technically invaded and took over Iceland peacefully for a year in order to prevent it from falling into the hands of the Germans. But this was heavily protested by the Icelandic government at the time, so in my books it still counts as an invasion. Italy, of course, was invaded by the British Army during the Second World War as well in 1943, but there were plenty of invasions before then, dating back to Richard the Lionheart's invasion in 1190. Germany, too, was obviously invaded by the British Army in 1945, and northwestern Germany was occupied by the British for 3 years until 1948. But a lot of German territory was ruled by Britain long before then. The islands of Heligoland were British for most of the 19th century, and the Kingdom of Hanover was effectively ruled under a personal union for over a century between 1714 and 1837. Austria was also invaded in 1945, and the southwest of the country was occupied for a decade. Norway was invaded in 1810 and 1812 during the Napoleonic Wars when it was a part of Denmark-Norway because Denmark was aligned to France, so obviously Denmark was invaded during that time as well. Finland, Estonia, and Latvia were all briefly invaded by small units during the Crimean War against Russia because they were all part of the Russian Empire at the time, and of course, Russia itself was invaded then too, as well as in 19...
It's wild how you can like think a country that's not even like 700-800 miles long does this to like the biggest country in the world. Like when you think about that, it's wild, but I guess there's other circumstances going into it, right?
When the British took over a large chunk of northern Russia for a time in their fight against the Bolsheviks. The territory of modern Ukraine was invaded by British army units during the Crimean War. The British took over the Croatian island of Vis between 1807 and 1814 during their fight against Napoleon. The British army had boots and guns on the ground in Bosnia recently between 1992 and 95 fighting against the Bosnian Serbs, and around the same time, the RAF also carried out bombing strikes against Serbian Serb targets in Serbia in 1999.
That recently, we bombed places in Serbia like 20 years ago. See, that is kind of mind-blowing. I didn't realise it would be this... Some of these would be like so recent.
Montenegro was briefly blockaded and invaded
especially in Europe.
During the First Balkan War. The British owned the westernmost Ionian islands of Greece between 1815 and 1863 before they gave them back, while Bulgaria was invaded and almost entirely occupied by the British Army between 1918 and 1919 at the end of World War I. Cyprus was a British protectorate between 1878 and 1914 when they decided to just outright annex it to piss off the Turks, and it remained annexed until 1960, except for 2 small chunks that are still British today. Turkey itself was massively invaded by the British during World War I, and part of it was occupied between 1919 and 1923. That wraps up Europe, so let's move on to Asia next. Modern-day Israel and Palestine, as well as Jordan, were British-controlled from the end of World War I.
Israel confuses me. Like, it says it's in Asia here, and if you look at like actually where it's based, like it is Asia, but when it comes to soccer or when it comes to football, their federation play in Europe, so that really always confuses me. Like they play in the European competitions, not in the Asian ones. If anyone knows why, I mean, I don't know if anyone would, but I would love to know why that's the case. It's the same with like Kazakhstan. Confuses me. But I mean, I guess there's just some sort of ruling there. I don't
1948 and 1946, respectively. Lebanon and Syria were both occupied from the Vichy French government briefly during World War II. Iraq was ruled between 1919 and 1932 and invaded again during the Second World War, and again in 1991, and again in 2003. Kuwait was a colony for over 60 years until 1966. Georgia and Azerbaijan were both invaded and occupied right at the end of World War I for a year. Iran has been invaded at least 3 times, with the most notable example being the joint Anglo-Soviet invasion of 1941. Turkmenistan was invaded in 1918 to prevent Bolshevik influence from spreading any further. Afghanistan is a favorite British invasion spot since it's been invaded in 1839, 1878, 1919, and again in 2001. Qatar, Bahrain, the United Arab Emirates, and Oman were all controlled by the British until the early 1970s, while a chunk of Yemen was controlled for over a century between 1839 and 1967.
What?
India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka were all, of course, invaded many times and outright ruled by the British Empire in parts for nearly 2 centuries between 1757 and 1947. Nepal was invaded in 1814 but never successfully conquered. Bhutan was invaded in 1772 and again in 1864 and was sort of conquered as a protectorate between 19...
I find it crazy how like a huge country like India gets conquered, but then a small country like Nepal never does. Is it just like maybe they go more out for other countries than others? And this isn't just for the UK. Like whenever another country tries to sort of, or when another country invades like another country, when a country invades another country, you see like how some of these huge countries get invaded, but then some don't successfully get invaded. I guess it's just like the amount of troops they try, maybe. I don't know like why that would be the case, but that is interesting.
10 in 1948. Burma/Myanmar was invaded in 1826 and was definitely successfully conquered and ruled through 1947.
My God.
Thailand was briefly invaded in 1945 since they were allied to Japan in World War II, and so was Vietnam in the same year, but that was to support the French government against the growing independence movement. Malaysia and Singapore were each conquered and ruled up until the 1950s and 1960s. Brunei was conquered and ruled up until the 1980s, whereas the Philippines were briefly invaded during the 7 Years' War. China got invaded a lot, and Hong Kong was a colony until as recently as 1997.
I've
and while
looked
not
into that.
outright invaded, part of Japan was occupied following World War II between 1946 and 1952. And finally, Indonesia was invaded a
I'm going to turn my brightness up a little bit. Seems a bit dark on my... That's my bad. It's been pretty dark the whole video. I apologise for that.
Launched during the Napoleonic Wars since it was a Dutch colony aligned to France at the time. Next up, Oceania. Australia and New Zealand, of course, were invaded by the British and established as colonies that each gained independence in 1931. Papua New Guinea was also a British colony for a time, as were the island countries of Fiji, Kiribati, the Solomon Islands, Tuvalu, and Vanuatu. Let's move back over to Africa next, which the British have violently visited a lot. In terms of just places the British outright colonized after invasions, there's the Gambia, Sierra Leone, Ghana, Nigeria, Egypt, Sudan, South Sudan, Uganda, Kenya, Tanzania, Zambia, Malawi, Zimbabwe, Botswana, Namibia, and South Africa, along with parts of modern-day Somalia and Guinea. Senegal was briefly invaded and had some of their coastline taken over in the 1700s, while during the Second World War, the British invaded the French colonies of Djibouti, Madagascar, and Comoros after they aligned themselves with the Nazi Vichy regime, and the Italian colonies of Libya, Eritrea, and Ethiopia, although they had also invaded Ethiopia much earlier in 1868. And as German colonies right before World War I, the British also invaded Togo and Cameroon without annexing them afterwards. For the final area of the world left to discuss, let's move over to the
So
Americas.
far, I'd say probably Asia is the most, like, that has the most countries invaded, right? Maybe it was the size of the Asian countries, but from what I remember, I'd say probably Asia so far.
All of Canada was a British colony until 1931, while Newfoundland remained until 1949. The United States, of course, was a colony until 1776, and was invaded
God damn
again
it.
in 1812, and the modern states of Oregon and Washington were claimed until 1949. The United States, of course, was a colony until 1776, and was invaded again in 1812.
Wow.
And the modern states of Oregon and Washington were claimed right up until 1846. As far as other outright British colonies here go, there was the Bahamas, Jamaica, Belize, Grenada, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, Barbados, St. Lucia, Dominica, Antigua and Barbuda, St. Kitts and Nevis, Trinidad and Tobago, and Guyana. Besides colonies, Cuba was invaded and occupied during the 7 Years' War in 1762. Haiti was invaded in 1793 during the French Revolutionary Wars. The Dominican Republic was invaded way back in 1655 in an attempt at conquest under Oliver Cromwell. Parts of the east coast of Honduras and Nicaragua were conquered and ruled for nearly 2 centuries until 1819. They sent the Navy to invade Mexico in 1861 to force them to repay some debts, and during the splendidly named War of Jenkins' Year, aka the more lame-sounding War of the Austrian Succession, the British invaded a lot of Spain's colonies, including Panama, a huge one into Colombia, and ultimately Peru. In 1796, the British took over Suriname because it was a Dutch colony, and they were allied with the revolutionary French and later Napoleon. They also invaded Martinique and Guadeloupe because they actually were French during the Napoleonic Wars. Venezuela was invaded in 1902 as part of the so-called Venezuela crisis to force the country to repay some debts they had defaulted on, kind of like Mexico, while Argentina and Uruguay were both invaded during the Napoleonic Wars as well in 1806 when Spain and her colonies were still allied with Napoleon. And that pretty much sums up all of the territory the British have ever ruled and all of the countries this small island has ever invaded. There are a total of 65 countries today who celebrate their independence days from the British Empire. The
Can't
empire
blame them.
used to rule over a
Cannot
quarter
blame
of all the world's land at the same time and was the biggest empire in human history. And in total, today, there have been 117 modern countries that have been aggressively invaded by the British Armed Forces during some point in their histories, representing a total of 60% of all the world's nations, which is almost the same number of countries that you can watch this video in. YouTube is available in 130 countries now, or about
That is-
2/3 of them, but the algorithm that YouTube uses won't always
That's
work
his,
the way you think.
plug, isn't
Or
it?
occasional creator
Yeah.
friends and I
Love that, man. Get your money on this. Banging video. That's interesting. I still don't really understand. Even though I'm from England and they don't really teach. I mean, they do teach us it, but like, they don't teach us how this sort of stuff happened. Like, I don't understand how England, such a small country, was able to even do this. Was it just like because their army was so advanced at that point? Like, I don't get it. I don't understand how it was possible. Every country England has invaded so far. Every country England has not invaded would be easier. That's actually true, because 60% of the countries were invaded. Britain is such a small island, yet somehow claims 60% of the world. Haha, we're a bored bunch. Not British land exists. The British... I see an issue. World exists, Britain is a free real estate. This explains why my British passport keeps getting rejected at the border. Yeah, I was wondering what these spellings were. Iraq, Washington. The world exists. England is this for me. Look out, Germany is going to invade everyone and take over the world. Britain, 1939. That is true. Britain was like a country that like invaded so many countries beforehand, and then they looked at what Germany were doing and were like, you can't be doing that when they've done it already. I mean, I guess Germany did it with a bit of sort of like, they wanted to have like a certain race and like certain beliefs, etc. But I assume that's how other countries do. Like, whenever another country invaded another country and tried to build their colonies, they wanted their sort of views of the perfect religions, beliefs, like whatever it was. So yes, it's strange how that was the case, but finding out about how evil the history of my country is, it's needed, right? It is needed, because you don't grow up learning about all these different things. Obviously, I did know that Britain at one point like invaded so many countries, and it was like one of those countries that it was the bad country, and I don't know if that's still how people look at it, but I can't really blame them if they do, because I know a lot of countries celebrate the Independence Day for reasons that I wouldn't be able to understand, but like I know why they do it, because of like the evil that they created, right? Like the evil that England created during trying to like own other countries, colonise, etc. But interesting look at this video. Hopefully you guys are going to enjoy. It's a bit different, but I'm down to do these random videos on the second channel. I do really enjoy looking and learning about these stuff. And if there's any more out there, let me know in the comments what you'd like me to see. And until next time, like, subscribe, and peace.